Hello, and welcome to the Sierra Speaker Series, brought to you by the California State Parks and the Sierra State Parks Foundation. My name is Denise Tran, and I am the Events and Communications Manager for the foundation. The Sierra Speaker Series shares and connects the rich cultural and natural history of the area to the community. Please donate to the foundation today to support the interpretation, restoration, and preservation of the park systems in the Lake Tahoe Donner area. Your tax-deductible donation will be kept locally and applied to priority projects. Please visit sierrastateparks.org to see how you can get involved and access upcoming events. With me today is Gary Jesch. Gary is a familiar face at the Thunderbird Lodge, located on the east shore of Tahoe. He served as a volunteer docent for 9 years and is now the community program manager. Gary spent much of his life in Tahoe due to his father being tasked to restore the famous Thunderbird yacht in the 60s. He now resides in Carson City, still nurturing his love for all things Tahoe, the history, people, places, and especially the water, sailing his catamarans or fishing on the North Shore. I'm so excited to hear the great Tahoe adventure from an insider's perspective. Please take it away, Gary.
Oh, so thank you, Denise, very much. I sure appreciate it. Yes, you're absolutely right. I do have some special ties when it comes to Lake Tahoe and the North Shore and the Thunderbird Lodge. As you said, my days of the Thunderbird go back 55 years to when I was just a little boy running around the property there. The Thunderbird Lodge, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a historic site. It's a museum and actually a solid rock castle located a couple miles south of Sand Harbor, there on the Nevada side, near Incline Village. And so the Thunderbird Lodge was actually built in the late 30s by a multimillionaire out of San Francisco, whose name was George Whittell Jr. And so that's where our story starts. Today, we're going to take you around the lake, the way that George himself might have experienced it many, many years ago. And so before I start, let me just go ahead and tell you a little bit about Whittell himself. And I may end up looking over there just occasionally because that's where my slides are. But I think you're going to really enjoy this. We've got some fun history, some sound effects, and a great way to end our program today. So stick around and enjoy this tale of adventure from the east shore of Lake Tahoe. So here's a picture of George Whittell Jr. And Whittell was born in 1880 in San Francisco to very wealthy parents, lived on Nob Hill there in San Francisco. And 1880 to 1900 is significant because that's when a bunch of new technologies that we are familiar with today all became around in our culture and were invented. Things like the movie camera and the telephone and railroad travel, automobiles, right? And even airplanes in the early 1900s. And Whittell, being born in the situation of being able to afford whatever he wanted, as he was growing up, he had a chance to dabble and to purchase whatever he wanted and to check it out. And one of the things that was really unique about things in his day was the advent of train travel. Train travel meant that people could actually move away from horse-drawn carriages and do their traveling in the comfort of a train car, and even to the point of going from one side of the country to the other, San Francisco to New York City, right, via St. Louis or Chicago or however they wanted to travel. And so they realized, the folks of San Francisco realized that just outside their doors, just over the summit of the Sierra Nevada, lay a beautiful lake. And that lake was very attractive even then, maybe even more so because it was sparsely populated, was full of fish. And the only drawback about it was that a few decades prior to the 1900s, starting in about 1860, the lumber barons from Virginia City cut down all the trees. So it was kind of basically clear cut, but it still offered great views and a bright blue lake and blue skies. So it was an exciting place to visit. And so that attracted people like Whittell up there from San Francisco. And this is what he, like, for example, Whittell was experiencing in San Francisco in about 1906, just a couple of years after the major earthquake that devastated that city. So you can see going down Market Street in an automobile, the cars were mixed with streetcars and automobiles. There you go. So that's kind of what it was like in San Francisco. So even then, it felt good to get away. And so the way that Whittell and some of these wealthy folks got away from San Francisco is they would get on a train in Oakland here, and they would ride all the way through Sacramento and come up here to Truckee. And at Truckee, they would hop off and they would get on another train and take that train up to Lake Tahoe, right up to Tahoe City. So you can look at this map here and you can see here's Truckee, and Truckee, from Truckee, you get on another train that came up the Truckee River, and that would take you right here to Tahoe Tavern. And there weren't really roads around Lake Tahoe at the time. So what they did to get around Lake Tahoe was they would hop on steamers. Those are steamships that were built by captains and owners in Lake Tahoe to navigate around the waters of the lake to get from Tahoe City, say to South Lake Tahoe, or to Glenbrook, or to Brockway, the area we know now as Kings Beach. So here's one of the trains that came up. This train was eventually converted to an engine on the V&T Railroad here in the Reno, Carson City area. And that train was actually picking people up, or I'm sorry, rather, that train was actually picking people up in Truckee and then dropping them off at a 900-foot long pier that was built to accommodate the SS Tahoe, which is a steamship that ran around the lake. So you can see here's the entire train is coming out on the pier, and passengers are unloading right off of the train, and they're transferred over to the SS Tahoe steamship from there to get ready to go around the lake. And here's the old Tahoe Tavern. And even nowadays, when you go up there, it's very close to the outlet of the Truckee River, and you can still see some of the old pilings. That's about all that's left of it up there. But it's a really interesting spot. And you can just imagine the activity of 100 or so passengers getting off of the train in the morning to pile on to the SS Tahoe. And so here's what a view looked like of actually being out on the pier, Lake Tahoe. So here's the Tahoe, here's the train right along here, and behind us would be like the Tahoe Tavern, and here are some other steamboats, big steamboats that were there to take excursions out. So on an excursion, what you would end up doing, what Whittell and his family might do after they arrived at Lake Tahoe and got on the SS Tahoe or one of these other ships, is they would take a circuit going all the way around the lake. And so this is what that looked like. This is the Tahoe, a beautiful ship. This ship was about 100 feet long, and it's passing by what this feature called the Lady of the Lake, which is at Cave Rock, also on the east shore. So you can see, looking at the snow on the mountains over here on the west shore, that it probably was about this time of year that this picture was taken. And I would guess this picture was taken probably close to 90 years ago. Give you an idea. And one of the things that was exciting was hearing the call of the steam whistle. There you go. And you heard that, you knew the Tahoe was out there on the water, or maybe getting ready to stop where you were located. So these are some of the stops for the steamers. And so right here is Tahoe City and Tahoe Tavern, where the journey started. And typically speaking, they would go counterclockwise, although they did go clockwise as well. But the typical trip was counterclockwise and hitting these spots along West Shore first, like Idlewild and Homewood, McKinney's, which is also Chambers Landing. And these were typically where there were hotels along the shore of Lake Tahoe where people could come and stay overnight or stay for a few days during the summer months to enjoy the atmosphere, the fishing, or just get away and do some recreation there at Lake Tahoe. And you can see that there was no stop here at Emerald Bay. Emerald Bay, the what we know as the Vikings' home castle in Emerald Bay, was just being built in the early 20s. So there wasn't a stop in there. But down here around Camp Richardson, we know the Talac and the Baldwin Estate, and those places have hotels on them, and they're national, or they're rather they're state parks now, state parks at Camp Richardson. And then going around South Lake, Bijou was also a stop at South Lake here. And then heading north into the Nevada side. So this is the Nevada-California border right in here, this V shape. They would stop at Zephyr Cove, and then they would make another stop at Glenbrook, which was really about the only place where there were any population at all on the East Shore in those days, because there was a big lumber camp there starting in the 1860s. And so by 1920 or so, they were switching away from the lumber industry over to the tourism industry. And so Glenbrook had a hotel where people could stay. And then from there, they were able to venture down the east side of the Sierra Nevadas into Carson City, Virginia City, and maybe even eventually into Reno. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that particular adventure here in a second. And then from Glenbrook on north, there was just really nothing here. This was all just logged out hillsides, basically. That's all that was there. Trees were all cut down, clear cut, nothing to offer, and really difficult to get around the shoreline of the lake. So there was just really not much there. The next stop would be Brockway, which was a hot springs that is located just a few miles to the east of what we know now as Kings Beach. And then Tahoe Vista, Carnelian Bay had a hotel, and then back to Tahoe Tavern. So that's kind of what it looked like up at Lake Tahoe in those days. And the Thunderbird Lodge, you saw that star, well, that's where Thunderbird Lodge and Whittell built it. He came up in the early 30s and bought all that land on the Nevada side of Lake Tahoe, and basically decided in about 1937 or so that he was going to build a secluded hunting lodge and summer cabin there. And that's what we know now as the Thunderbird Lodge. And so Whittell was definitely a factor in terms of the conservation of the east shore of Lake Tahoe, because he had purchased that 27 miles of shoreline. Today, there's very little development on that land, and a majority of it is held either by the Nevada State Park system around Sand Harbor and Spooner Lake and Marlette Lake up in the top of the Sierras, or it's held by the U.S. Forest Service. So that's the impact that our hero and adventurer, George Whittell, had on Lake Tahoe for many, many years. Let's take a look here. This is the SS Tahoe in Carnelian Bay. So not much around there. You can't really see too many houses in that, but there's a pier that comes out right along here, and that's where folks would get on and off of this ship. Another popular steamship up at Lake Tahoe was the SS Meteor, a smaller ship by far, but very much an open air, a comfortable boat that also did circuits to these various hotels around Lake Tahoe. So if you were a multimillionaire or even fairly well-to-do, you could come up and you could spend some money and you could go around Lake Tahoe, stay in hotels, travel, pick up a steamer as it was headed on its way by, go down to visit, like, say, Baldwin Beach or Lakeside or Zephyr Cove, all by steamboat, stop for a while and come back and pick up another steamer that was passing by soon. The other thing about the steamers is that some of them were not actually vessels for passengers. They were tugboats. And so Whittell, we believe, took advantage of this because he was into the automobiles and that in those days. And so he could put his automobile on a train car in Oakland or San Francisco, where he is from, And that train would bring his automobile, his horseless carriage, all the way up to Truckee, transfer it to another car, and then bring that automobile into Tahoe City by train. His roads were terrible in those days, dirt mostly, especially over the Donner Summit and the mountain pass there, not much to behold at all. So for the folks wanted to come up to Lake Tahoe, it made a lot of sense to actually have your car transported, less wear and tear on the car, and a lot less risky of in case you broke down. It wasn't like you could just call AAA on Donner Summit in those days. So what these fellows did is they would put their cars on barges, and they would barge around Lake Tahoe to these various stops. So, for example, say you had your car hauled over to Camp Richardson. Well, Camp Richardson, there were a lot of logging roads and old train tracks and that type of thing. So you could actually motor around a lot of South Lake Tahoe by automobile once you got your car down there. And so that seemed to be a really fun thing to do. In fact, you could even head out partway along Luther Pass to Hope Valley and work your way down Hope Valley and Walker River over there down into the eastern regions of the Sierra Nevadas, including down into the Carson Valley, Eagle Valley, and that. So it really opened the door to an easy way to get into northern Nevada. It was through having your car hauled across Lake Tahoe. So these folks, as you can see, this is probably from about the late 1910s, early 1920s, right? And pretty rugged automobile. Looks like they've been driving around on the dirt roads for a while. You could get hauled all the way to Glenbrook on the far side of the lake from Tahoe City. And in Glenbrook, there were some old train tracks and a dirt road that you could follow all the way over the hill, what we know now as Spooner Summit, and then coming down into Carson City on the old stagecoach road. And you had to be pretty brave to do that because that was a rough, narrow road in those days. And it was also shared with stagecoaches that were still in use coming the other direction. So it was definitely an adventure to behold. One of the steamships that was involved in that particular adventure that I've got a story about was the SS Niagara. And the Niagara picked up people over in Tahoe City as they came in from Truckee. And this is a nice shot of the Niagara. It's not a big steamer, but it had a special mission. So for $13 back in those days, which is a pretty good amount of money in 1920, you could actually do a day and a half long Tahoe adventure, just like we're talking about here. So you would ride the train into Truckee, okay, maybe the night before, the day before, because it was still an 8 to 10 hour trip from San Francisco to Truckee by train, maybe even a little longer than that, right? So when you got into Truckee, the next morning, you would leave that railroad or your hotel in Truckee, and you would get on the little run that came from Truckee up to Tahoe City, right? So you would come up by Moody's stage in this particular one, which is a stagecoach, and then you would meet the Niagara, right, by that steamboat I just showed you in Tahoe City. You go out on the pier, climb on board the Niagara, and then you would cruise across Lake Tahoe, all the way across, 17 miles across, the lake 17 miles across and 22 miles north and south, where you would get to Glenbrook. In Glenbrook, you would hop onto a stagecoach driven by Hank Monk himself, a famous stagecoach driver, actually the star of many stories told, including stories by Mark Twain himself. And you would ride that stagecoach all the way down to Carson City, where you would then pick up the V&T Railroad. So the V&T was a passenger railroad and a cargo railroad going from Carson City to Virginia City and then to Reno. So you got to go to Virginia City and spend the day. And then at the end of your day in Virginia City, you would go down to Reno. And that's where you would pick up your train at Central Pacific to either go back to San Francisco, or maybe even if you were heading east, you could go and continue on east through Nevada and cross country that way. So talk about a wild adventure. And you can book that with your travel agent. There you go. You can book it with your travel agent there in San Francisco. So here's an old shot. This goes back many years, probably almost 100 years, to a shot of the pier in Glenbrook with the Niagara sitting there. And up on the hill here is the Glenbrook Hotel. And you can see the trees are starting to grow back a little bit. Not too bad, but you know, if you were going further north, you could see the devastation caused by the clear cutting. So there's a Niagara. And then here's an artist drawing of Hank Monk at the reins of his stagecoach. And I looked at this and I thought, well, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to be a pretty brave woman back 100 years ago to be feeling like you could safely hop up on the top bench with Hank Monk himself. Talk about a white knuckle ride, huh? I mean, you know, it's a mad dash, but who would want to be sitting inside of the stagecoach and not being able to see the sights going right down the hill into Carson City, down through Kings Canyon, and that, you know, crossing that way into Carson City. There's a very narrow trail that comes down, if you're familiar with Carson City at all now, full of these really tight switchbacks. And I would just be, you know, personally hoping that the brakes held out. And as we said, once you got into Carson, these are the yards of the train, the V&T in Carson City. And I think we got a little train music or audio here. There you go. That's what those old trains sounded like. And you come on up here into Virginia City, and this is an old photograph looking down the hill. It's down 6 Mile Canyon from the upper bounds of Virginia City back in about 1920, I believe this photo was taken. You can see St. Mary's Church right in here, and some of the diggings from some of the mines over here, the Yellow Jacket and the Collar Mine still, you know, in the picture. So yeah, let's go back and we'll play this while we're looking here. So this is the B&T. And actually, I was told that this is a photo of the B&T coming into Reno on what we now call Pluma Street, which is like Midtown Reno here, passing by basically in those days, the outer boonies of Reno, just a mile or two from downtown, right? So yeah, engine number 22. And as I said earlier, if you were a really brave soul, you might go ahead and plan a trip coming out of San Francisco and hitting the dirt roads to go up to Donner Summit, where, you know, things were, you know, wide open spaces. That's Donner Lake down in the view behind. And you had to, thing about Donner Summit is you had to wait till the snow all melted. So a lot of times that wasn't until July. But some of these antique car clubs, these horseless carriage clubs based in Sacramento, would have contests in the summertime or in the spring to see who could get their automobile over Donner Summit first. And, you know, they were bringing up lots of boards and rope and winch or come-alongs and everything else to try to make sure that their vehicles could get through big snowbanks and patches of snow and ice to make it on that old road. So let's go check out what Whittell was doing, right? So our hero of today, George Whittell Jr., Captain as they called him, was a big fan of automobiles also. And here's a shot of him in the very early days. He's probably like in his early 30s, so that would put him around 1910, maybe 1915, on a little open rig that he liked, and his mechanic was right there with him, so in case he had a problem and that they'd be able to fix it on the spot. But he liked to drive. Whittell did some of the outings himself. This is a little bit later. This is in the, I believe I would say probably the very late 20s and right before the Depression. And Whittell actually journeyed into Nevada, into northern Nevada. We have photos of him in his automobile. And oftentimes he would have another vehicle follow behind him, because that vehicle would be his mechanic with spare tires, gasoline, extra parts, a big jack to get him out of a stuck spot. Again, traveling around, this I believe is out in the Sierra, the Eastern Sierra. I think a little bit further south of Lake Tahoe, down along the road toward Bridgeport, and maybe even further down around Tom's cabin, with him and his wife braving the trails. And of course, the car was pretty cool if you were the captain, right? Because you could climb up on top of it and look in all directions to kind of get an idea of where you were headed, and if the creek had washed out, basically, over the winter. So that's George Whittell standing up on top of his vehicle, looking around, and somebody got a photo of him. Also in those days, the airplane became a viable way of transporting yourself and your friends around to some extent. By the 1920s or so, the basic airplanes. This is a seaplane, and that's Whittell, the guy without the helmet, sitting in the aircraft. This is a big twin engine setup, and Whittell actually stayed in aviation his whole life. By the time he got up to the Thunderbird Lodge in the 30s, he had a Grumman seaplane, a Grumman Goose, and he was famous for flying in from San Francisco in the Grumman and landing there at Sand Harbor, which was part of the property that he had picked up in his purchase. And of course, nothing like horseback, the reliable way to do it. And of course, a lot of people still used horses to explore the wilderness surrounding Lake Tahoe. And you can see Whittell here was an avid horseman. When he wasn't in Lake Tahoe, he was often traveling between the US and Europe via cruise ship or on his own private yacht. So this is Whittell and his wife Alia around the time that he built the Thunderbird Lodge, which would have been in the late 30s. So by then he was going on 60 years old. And he had met his wife Alia right in around the end of World War One, and they had married, and they were living part of the time in San Francisco. She maintained a chateau in the French Loire Valley, and she would come out to California occasionally, often by ship to New York, and then from New York to California by train. So she was an adventurous person herself, and Whittell enjoyed that, and he also enjoyed the freedom of being able to run around and have his own type of fun when Alia was back home in Europe. The Todd Goodwin, going back to steamers here on the Lake Tahoe waters, was a yacht that Whittell was particularly favorited, and it was a very comfortable yacht, and it took them back and forth from Tahoe City to the Thunderbird Lodge, where they were met by a butler or his man in the dinghy, and they would transfer from the Todd Goodwin onto the dinghy and then over to the yacht, or to the, I'm sorry. I know, I love playing those whistles. They would transfer from the dinghy onto the shore where their Thunderbird Lodge is. I'll play that whistle for you one more time, just for fun. Isn't that great? So the other smaller steamship that was traveling around, and actually I think this was gasoline powered, is the Wild Goose. And so here's the Wild Goose sitting out in front of Tahoe Tavern in Tahoe City, not far from the pier. And you can see it's got a smaller passenger load of people waving and cheering him on. Young man sitting up here on the bow on a beautiful summer day at Lake Tahoe. A lot of people ask me what happened to the SS Tahoe. Well, in about 1935 or so, it's ceased operations. It was owned and run by D.L. Bliss out of Glenbrook at the time, and he had several other of the big yachts on Lake Tahoe. And so he went ahead and he parked it there on the pier at Tahoe City in about 1935, and he wasn't operating it anymore. And so it wasn't going out. And actually, vandals were getting onto the boat and destroying it, taking pieces off of it, graffiti inside of it, and just basically it turned into a big mess out there. So at about 1940, Bliss decided that he was going to go ahead and sink her out in the lake rather than see his treasured, beloved boat cut up for scrap and used to build tanks and army trucks. So he announced that he was going to haul the Tahoe off on the morning of, I forget the exact date, but anyway, he was going to haul the yacht off in the morning. But the prior night, he got a hold of the captain of the yacht and another man, and they towed the yacht off the pier all the way across to Glenbrook. About 200 yards off the shore of Glenbrook, they pulled the plugs on the Tahoe and watched it slip into the black, murky waters of Lake Tahoe around 400 yards offshore. And that's where it sits today, is down there in around 400 feet of water. When it hit the bottom was pretty sloped, and so the boat just kind of slid down and it buried itself into the sand. And that's where it's sitting. And it's just out of range of scuba divers. So it hasn't been visited very much. Only a few number of times have they actually been able to get down and dive to it. There was talk over the last half a decade or so, or half a century or so, starting around in the 1960s, including even Bill Harrah himself, about raising the Tahoe and restoring it. But it never turned out to be feasible. One of their fears was that it would bust in half, or as they were trying to bring it up, and then sink permanently. So that boat's still down there at the bottom. And actually, the Meteor is also. Bliss was the owner of the Meteor and scuttled it. I think it was about 2 years before he sunk the Tahoe. You can go online and look up SS Tahoe, and you will actually be able to see video of an exploration of that boat on the bottom of the lake. And I highly recommend that. It's fascinating. Shows a group of guys about 10 years or so ago that went down, that dove down using highly advanced diving techniques, and they shot video of the boat sitting on the bottom. And just to show you where it is, this is the Thunderbird up here on the red dot, and down here is Glenbrook right in here. And this is where the Tahoe is sitting today, right down in here. So we're here. Sand Harbor is up in here. So it's about, I think, 5 or 6 miles south of us. And this is Dead Man's Point right in here. So if you get out into this water here, right below you is the SS Tahoe sitting on the bottom. As far as the mail runs, those steamers were also delivering mail when they were going around to the hotels around Lake Tahoe, and that there was a need for that. And the SS Marion was the boat that actually filled the need, delivering the mail all around the lake. So it did a circuit around the lake also, and it also stopped on occasion when there was mail for Whittell there at Thunderbird Lodge as it would pass by. And it did that. And I believe the Marion, I'll have to go back and double check, but I think the Marion mysteriously sunk on Lake Tahoe and is sitting down at the bottom now too. So Tahoe claims a few boats, but it's a great story, a great adventure. So, speaking of your great adventure at Lake Tahoe, we'd like to invite you folks to come on and visit us up at the Thunderbird Lodge. Here's the picture of this castle. It's built of solid rock. The black is all wrought iron sculpture. the fountain here, pools all around it. So it's got everything you'd want in a castle, right? Rock walls, a moat, sitting at the shore of a lake, all made of rock and steel. And we've been trying to do our best to take care of it, to preserve it. It's now 80 years old or so. And, it's a big job maintaining this. Over the years, when we were in full operation, we were getting around 100 visitors a day in our public tour program. They would come in from Incline Village and visit us for an hour and a half, and I'd be, as a docent, taking them around. We have 100 volunteers that work up here at the lodge. And so, this summer it's going to be kind of abbreviated, I guess you would call it, because of the situation around the pandemic. We are going to be opening, but we're not going to be in full operation this summer, and we hope to be back in full operation 100% by 2022. However, we are offering tours 3 days a week as far as our plans are right now, and you can get to those and come up and see the real Queen of Lake Tahoe, the latest, best yacht on the lake, which is the Thunderbird itself. And this is the yacht that George Whittell had built and delivered to the lake in 1940, and he cruised around in this until he sold it to Bill Harrah in the early 60s. And that's when my dad started working on this yacht. Harrah, as the owner, had my dad and Harrah's crew put this flying bridge on it here, this part of the boat. And they also built and inserted two 1,200 horsepower Allison aircraft engines. And those are the engines in it right now. Would you like to hear what those sound like? Here, let me play a little sound effect on those. So that's an idle right now. That's kind of what it sounds like when it's idling out there. This really doesn't even do it justice. But when Bill Harrah owned this yacht, he had my father and the boat crew work on it and get it set up to where it would do 60 miles an hour out on Lake Tahoe. No kidding. We don't do that anymore. But nowadays, if you come up on a tour, you'll see here most likely in our boathouse. The boathouse was built by Whittell, especially custom built for this yacht. Look at that beautiful yacht. So you come up and you can see the yacht and see the castle and the secret tunnels and all the fine stuff on one of your visits. To get in and connect up to us, call us at 800-GO-TAHOE. You can also visit our website at thunderbirdtahoe.org. And we do also look for donations to save the castle, to help with our costs of preservation. And again, to say thank you to you and all the folks with Sierra Parks and Denise and everybody. Thank you so much on behalf of the Thunderbird Lodge Preservation Society. And just to send you off, I shot this video. One more slide, or one more video, Denise, and that is of looking out the back of the Thunderbird yacht taking out across the lake. That's Whittell's castle in the background right there. In fact, sometimes I do.
Looks like a very fast boat.
Like yeah.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
I've always thought it'd be so cool to go back in time and like see how life is. And I think your presentation was like the next best thing.
Oh, thank you so much. It's sure interesting, the history of Lake Tahoe. Thank goodness there are organizations like yourself and us, Vikings Home, and that, that preserve that legacy so that future generations will be able to appreciate it also, right?
Absolutely. And that's our mission. With closing remarks, the Sierra Speaker Series, brought to you by the California State Parks and Sierra State Parks Foundation, shares and connects the rich and cultural history of the area to the community. Please donate to the foundation today to support the interpretation, preservation, and restoration of our park systems in the Lake Tahoe Donner area. Your tax-deductible donation will be kept locally and applied to priority projects. Please visit sierrastateparks.org to see how you can get involved and access upcoming events. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
We'll take some questions, right, Denise?
Yes.